Looks like we're starting to get people jumping in here. You may not be able to see it, but I can see it. If you are on a computer, I'm not quite 100% sure how the cell phone part of this, if you are joining us on a cell phone or on a call-in, not 100% sure how that works, but I know if you're joining the webinar on a computer, you can move your cursor around on top of the video screen, and towards the bottom you'll see a list of icons. Participants, chat, and Q&A should be three things that you see. Feel free to type some things in chat, but save your questions for the Q&A section, or there's another way to do this when I bring up the slides here in a second. There's another way that you guys can jump in on the Q&A. Besides the Q&A panel on the bottom of this, the icon on the bottom of the video screen. If you want to raise your hand, if you go into, I believe it's into the participants list, and you find your name, and you can click, when you highlight your name with the cursor, you can click on, I believe there's a button that says more or options right beside your name, and you can click raise your hand, or there may also be an icon at the bottom of the video screen where you can click that to raise your hand. Yep, Wayne just found it. And when we get to our Q&A, there I see Ashley and Benji just found it. When we get to our Q&A, that'll be a way that if you want to jump in and actually ask your question live, I should be able to promote you guys to panelists, or at least take you off of mute, so that you guys can get on and ask questions during our Q&A towards the end of this, and you can ask your question live in front of everybody, and we can kind of have more of a conversation rather than just somebody asking me a question and me being the only one talking. So we kind of hash some things out together here. I like when we make conversations rather than just you asking questions and me talking, because I think it allows more people to kind of get a better idea, and maybe even ask some questions of their own, and we can touch on some things that go on, more questions that come up in live time, and even address certain thoughts that are going through your head. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. It looks like we've got well over 20 now, and it'll probably keep growing as we go through. So I'm going to bring up my screen share here. And takes just a second. There we go. All right. So I hope everybody can see the screen here. Again, I'll cover that information. We're going to go over what are the biggest shooting mistakes made. And this is not just from the shooter's perspective, but this is from the coach's perspective, the trainer's perspective, the player's perspective, the parent's perspective. This is from many different perspectives. We're not just talking about techniques here. We're talking about the whole realm of shooting and what all is involved with learning how to shoot and improving your shot. So that's the subjects that I'm going to be covering, and I'm going to cover 10 different ideas that I've got over the next 5 webinars, and address those and kind of give our philosophy behind those and what I think sets us apart from most other shooting coaches. So again, as I said, there we go. I went too far. So when we get to the Q&A, and you'll see the slide pop up for that at the end, here is the instructions for that. You can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your video display, and it'll bring up a little text box where you can type the question in, and that lets me know in order of who asked them, the questions that are being asked, and I can go through those and address them one by one as we go through the Q&A. And also you can use the raise your hand button in the attendance list, and I think there's also an icon on the bottom of the video screen as well for you to raise your hand. And that's for if you would like to jump in and ask your question live with me and actually have a conversation. So we can use both of those. And we'll go ahead and get started here. So the first thing I wanted to cover is kind of just looking at the jump shot from a perspective of all the different factors that go into a jump shot, okay? So when we make mistakes, you can see here by this little flow chart, this grid chart, what all the different factors are involved in maybe a shooter being good or bad or average. And so we're not really going to cover these things though, okay? Because this stuff pertains specifically to the shooter. And I want to look at this in a more broader sense. So you can see just the relationship of all the different uh, all the different factors that go into this from a shooter standpoint here. And we're going to cover more towards the bottom at about 7 o'clock where it says other variables. Okay. And there'll be a couple things that we cover that are on opponent presence and just different stuff like that. But we're going to cover some of these other variables that are a little bit further out of the spectrum and a little bit more from a parent, coach, and player perspective. Okay. So there are some categories here that I just wanted to point out that you can make mistakes in. You can make a mistake in your technique. You can make a mistake in your shot selection. You can make a mistake in how much time you practice. You can make a mistake in what kind of drills you use. If you're not using drills that are catered to what you want to improve in, then these are things that you can make. These are mistakes that you can make. But I want to cover one that I think is one of the biggest things that makes us different than most other shooting coaches out there. And that is the philosophy. And what I mean by philosophy is kind of the approach behind how we approach teaching our techniques and how we order our techniques and how we organize our system, because we want a player's approach to improvement, and we want to know what are some of the challenges that shooters face that are overlooked. Obviously, some of the techniques, if a shooter's not familiar with a technique, that's going to present a challenge for a short period of time. But I want to look at the stuff that may present a challenge over the longer period of time, or that may present a challenge outside of just the technique itself, and more so the philosophy and the way you analyze and the way you look at a player's shot and figure out, okay, what does this player need? What do I need to teach them from a coach's standpoint to get better? Or from a parent standpoint, who do I go to set my kid up for success as a shooter? And from a player's standpoint, what is my coach working with me on? Are they working with me on something that they're just telling me to do, or are they giving me the why and the how behind it, and properly covering the problems that I have and giving me a good fix for that? Okay, so philosophy here is we're going to talk about what do you simplify. So within the shooting action and how it's taught, what are we simplifying? And what I mean by this is there are a lot of coaches that limit players. There are a lot of parents who try to teach their players to shoot, and they limit their players from the standpoint of they restrict certain motions that they may not see as relative, so they're simplifying the actions. There's I don't want to call out any names and call anybody out, but you guys have probably seen other shooting coaches out there. There's a quote NBA shooting coach who talks about specifically about simplifying actions and about getting everything out of your jump shot except for the stuff that you directly need in your jump shot. And that would be classified as simplifying the action. Okay. And then there's the approach of, I don't want to simplify the action. I want to simplify the information. Okay. So those are two general categories that we're going to create as options here. Do I want to simplify the action and limit players to what they can do and try to make them a more efficient shooter from the standpoint of dialing back on their movement and only using movement that is specifically related to what I feel is going to make their shot successful? Or do I want to look at the entire shot in general and simplify the information that I'm giving as a teacher to the player, the shooter, in order to help them wrap their mind around the concept of the action and how it's performed? Okay. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's really, we're weighing here the difference between simplifying the action of shooting and simplifying the information we use to communicate with the player on how to shoot. And I'll give specific examples of those later. So what do you simplify as a coach or as a player or as a parent? What do you simplify? Are you simplifying the player's actions, or are you simplifying the information that you give to the player so that they can complete an action? Because I think we can all agree that shooting is a very complex skill. It's a very complex motion. The entire body is involved in shooting. So you can't just shut off parts of your body. Your body has to work collectively as an entire unit. And when you start separating, units of your body from one another, say your arm from your legs and your head from your hips, when you start separating units of the body like that, you're going to separate actions and not allow players to really keep a fluid, smooth motion in their jump shot. So that's what I'm talking about here. Because simplifying the action will cause them to be more rigid and be more stiff and be more jagged in their movement patterns, while simplifying the information will allow them to freely move, but it will allow them to understand what the goals are that they're trying to accomplish within their movement. So that's kind of a comparison here between the two styles. So when we dive into this, we have to ask ourselves, is there a wrong way and a right way to shoot? Okay? And I refute this. I do not believe there is a wrong way and a right way to shoot from a general standpoint. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I don't like to use these words. And the reason I don't like to use these words is because from a teaching standpoint, if you can find the right term to use, which is why we label all of our techniques with specific terms, if you can find the right term to use, you can communicate your message in one word when it may take somebody else 1,000 words to explain what they mean. So that's our goal here. Our goal here is to simplify the information so that the one term or the one phrase that we give in teaching them how to shoot, sometimes it takes a specific stance, sometimes it takes a more general, broad stance. But there's a reason because of that, because we want them to be able to relate different techniques together and join those techniques together. So if somebody were to ask me, is there a right way or a wrong way to shoot, I would say specifically, no. But generally, yes. And here's what I mean by that. I like to categorize this right-wrong slightly differently to help people kind of understand it. The words I like to use are efficient or inefficient, okay? Is what we're teaching our player, is what our player is using as a technique, is it an efficient technique that's going to move me further up the efficiency scale? Or is it an inefficient technique that's going to move me further down the efficiency scale? Okay? And these are related, but they're not directly related. And the reason for that is because the further you move down the inefficiency scale, all right, you can see here right in the center, I have this dividing line where you're balanced between efficiency and inefficiency, all right? You're not as efficient as you could be, but you're not inefficient either. You're just kind of sitting on the fence in between the two and trying to figure out from the changes you make from here on out, where are you going to go? Are you going to go more towards the efficient side, or are you going to go more towards the inefficient side? And so to be politically correct here, I guess you would say, you have to realize that in the efficiency and inefficiency scale, there comes a point where shots can no longer be made. I mean, you will reach a point of inefficiency at some point where you can't make shots anymore. It is technically a wrong way to shoot. Okay, so the scale kind of starts there. Once you get on, in my slide here, once you get on the right side of that point where it's no longer possible to make shots, then you can still make shots, but you're very inefficient at doing so. So once you get on the line or to the left of the line, then it is definitely a wrong way to shoot, and it gives you no hope to make a shot using those techniques. So you have to find something to change to get back to the right side of that. Okay, and then we could say that, for instance, you see how the green arrow here on top of the efficiency and inefficiency arrows, the green arrow starts just to the right of that red line that separates me from not being able to make anything and being able to make very few or very low percentage of my shots. So could we categorize that as the right way to shoot? Well, technically we could, because you can make shots that way. And so what I'm saying is, from a perspective of the shooter, and the teacher and the parent, we have to find out where a player falls along this green arrow, or if they're on the red line or to the left of the red line, we've got to figure out a way to get them back on to the right side of that red line where they can't possibly make a shot like that. Okay, and the thing with this is that you'll see different techniques lined up all along this. And so our whole thing with the turn and square up, for instance, one of the biggest differences we have in terminology and technique with a lot of other coaches out there is, to me, in my research and looking at how the human body is built and how the human body works, if you square up, it's not a wrong way to shoot. It's just an inefficient way to shoot. So you're going to be along the green line because you can still make shots like that, but you're going to be setting back here in the word inefficiency. You're going to be setting back here somewhere over the F's or the I's or the C or the E or the N in your scale of efficiency and inefficiency. And what the turn allows you to do, because we're one-handed shooters, is allows you to get the dominant shooting side of your body better aligned with the basket to move you further right up the scale of efficiency. So it's getting us to move up that scale and getting further away from that wrong way to shoot and more towards the optimal way to shoot. Okay? I'm not gonna sit here and claim that I have all the answers to shooting and say that the turn is going to get you all the way up the scale, because it's not. You know, there may be something else, some other technique that we haven't discovered as a human race yet that is going to move me even further and further up that scale to where I don't miss any shots, or where I'm shooting 98 or 99%. Okay, and to get up there though, we haven't found those kinds of techniques yet. So we have to deal with what we're given, and what we're given is the comparison of the square up with the turn. Okay, and that's kind of the comparison we got to make here. Is the technique that we're using going to move us further to the right up efficiency, or is it going to move us further to the left down away from efficiency? Okay, so here's what I typically see from a general standpoint. When you simplify actions and you start separating those different units of the shooter and allowing them to not work together the way they should, by simplifying the action and separating the movements of the shooter and making them more rigid, you're moving them down the scale of efficiency. You're moving them towards the inefficient side of the spectrum. You may not move them all the way close to the wrong point, but you're moving them in a direction that we don't want to go, because we want to go to the efficient side. We want to keep climbing the ladder of efficiency, so to say. So what I've found is that by simply simplifying the information, the communication between you and the player, and not limiting them in their movements, and not limiting them in only use this part of your body or only use this part of your body. When you do that, you start to climb up the efficiency scale, because it gets rid of these rigid, stiff, tense movements that players have in them. And so they find a way to use their body in a more efficient and athletic way. Okay? So that's kind of what we're looking at here on the action and the information. And that's kind of a general overview of the first mistake that I see a lot of players and coaches and parents make, is that oftentimes they try to simplify the action instead of simplifying the information that they're trying to communicate to the player. Because when you simplify the action, you're taking away this complex series of movements that a player likes to make in their shot. And you're making those movements more rigid. And by making them simpler, you're kind of separating those movements from one another, where they can't work all parts of their body together into one smooth, fluid motion. Okay? But if we just simplify the information, they'll be able to keep all these movements together. They'll be able to move smoothly and transition from one movement to the next without having a rigid type shooting form, without having a rigid action or an action that ends abruptly and then a new one starts. Okay? So that's kind of the best way I can kind of explain that without using video. And I really am looking forward to getting some videos together to kind of further show this and explain this. And it's really, this is what, understanding this philosophy is what allows me to look at a shooter and tell a good shooter from a bad shooter, or a shooter that could experience really quick improvement versus a shooter that's going to be a longer, it's going to be a longer haul. It's going to be a longer process for them to move up the efficiency scale. And that's something that I used when I was coaching junior college basketball back in 2015 through 2018. Is, I was on the D3 level. I didn't have scholarships to give out. I would have to go out, and I wanted a team that could shoot. So I would have to go out and find guys, and a lot of guys that I would recruit had never worked with me before. But I wanted to get to the point where I could identify guys that were going to become good shooters within my team structure and could move forward and learn and climb that ladder of efficiency. So I would look for any kind of jerky motions. I would look for any kind of rigid motions. But if their shot was pretty smooth overall, I knew that they were going to be like putty when I got them, because you can kind of mold them around because they already had those smooth transitions between their movements. You could do a pretty good job of just making little tweaks here and there and getting the most out of them that you possibly could. And by doing that, we were second in the nation in three-point percentage. We shot 43.9% from the three-point line and ended up shooting. We were in the top 30 in the nation for free throw percentage just in our third year. And if you don't know anything about starting JUCOs, when you start a JUCO with all the rules that are out there that the NCAA and NJCAA has sanctioned on programs now, usually programs like that are brand new, that have never existed before, that you start from scratch like I did, it takes them about 7 or 8 years to start experiencing any kind of success. So that was, I think, a way that I found a leg up on the competition, was teaching my guys to be as best shooters as they could. And we had 8 guys on our team that shot over 40% from the three-point line. And we had 2 guys on our team that shot over 50% from the three-point line. So just finding those players that have smooth transitions in their motion will help you to understand maybe how to simplify the information and not simplify the action. Okay. So like I said, we must simplify the information, not the action. The next thing I want to talk about before we get into our Q&A is just a short one here. And this is the process versus the result. Okay. And so getting away from this simplifying the action of shooting versus simplifying the information on how to shoot is the process versus the result. And I have a better way that I put this that's a little more understandable, especially to younger shooters, because they cover this stuff at a young age in elementary school, is we talk about cause and effect. Okay. And we talk about, all right, is this mistake that you're making, is it a cause? In other words, is it process related? Or is it an effect? Is something else that you're doing affecting this mistake and causing this mistake to happen? Okay, so cause relates to the process and the effect relates to the result. All right. So a cause and effect example. We had as coaches, I think it was mainly sent out to coaches, and there were a few who are not coaches that got light of it, but we've had great opportunities as a nation of coaches at the college level. Since we didn't have the Final Four, usually all the college coaches and even some non-college coaches, recruiters, NBA scouts, all these different levels of guys that are involved within the game. Usually we all go to the Final Four every year, and we have a big gathering and a big, it's called the NABC conference for the men's side. It's called the WBCA conference for the women's side. And it's a way as a coach to come together and kind of sharpen your skills, get ideas from other presenters, get ideas from other coaches. And since the NCAA tournaments were canceled this year and we couldn't go, we actually had a couple guys put on a virtual coaches clinic, which is like what we're doing here. They just had webinars, and they would have people sign up for the webinar, and they would do about an hour long talk on a webinar where us as coaches could come in and view these webinars and ask questions, interact, all that kind of stuff with these coaches. I mean, you had guys on there that were NBA guys. You had guys on there that were top-level NCAA coaches. You had guys on there that were doing more specific player development stuff. You had guys on there that were doing X's and O's. You had guys on there that were doing just sports psychology. There were tons of coaches, both male and female, that were just throwing out all these ideas, and we could sit and watch those for hours on end back in late March and early April. And they asked me to be a presenter on this. And as I was presenting on this, I had a question towards the end of my presentation. And somebody asked me something that I'm going to give you a specific example of cause versus effect here, is they said, I'm having trouble when I shoot with the index finger release technique. Is that every time I shoot, my index finger wants to pull to the side. What can I do to fix that? And they were thinking I was going to give them some magical trick to do with your index finger that would keep it straight. And what they didn't realize is that I told them, you need to look at the things that come before the finger, because something that comes before the finger could be affecting what the finger does at the end of the shot. In other words, the finger may pull to the side because your shoulder isn't aligned with the basket, or the finger may pull to the side because you're too stiff in how you shoot. Like your body's not getting enough freedom and not getting enough flow in your motion to allow you to just keep that finger in a straight line towards the basket, that there's some kind of tension or some kind of force elsewhere in the body that is causing the effect of the finger pulling to the side. And typically when I see stuff like that, where I see maybe the elbow flaring out, or maybe I see the index finger pulling to the side, or I see the offhand kind of pulling through and pushing through on the shot, I always go to the shoulders, because the shoulders are kind of that pivot point, that separation between the upper body and lower body for a player. And I go to the shoulders because if you don't have your shoulders in an efficient position as a shooter, you're going to have a lot of problems in your shot. because I relate the upper body, everything from the shoulders up deals with accuracy, and everything from the shoulders down deals with your range. Those are the first two categories or sections in our ART acronym. Is we want to be accurate first. We want to gain power in range so that we can be a better shooter from further away. And then the T stands for transitions, putting those things together and actually being able to flow between movements and even give ourselves a mental edge as a shooter, give ourselves some different areas to look at to kind of clean the movements up and to clean things up from a technique standpoint, and help all these techniques just flow together and benefit the shooter to move them further up that efficiency scale. Okay, so that's a specific example of the cause versus the effect. That just because your finger is doing something wrong, that doesn't mean that your finger is the cause. It could mean that your finger is being affected by something else that is the cause, and therefore your finger pulling to the side is an effect, not a cause. All right, so those are just that's just an example of cause and effect, cause versus effect, and talking from the perspective. Check what time it is because I want to give you guys plenty of time to do the Q&A. It just gives you guys a kind of example of just because you see one thing go wrong in a player's shot doesn't mean that that thing is what you need to correct. It's often influenced by something else in the body, some other movement or some other position or restricted motion by another part of the body that restricts the motion by the finger or the elbow. Or for example, what can cause me to have my elbow flaring out? Well, if I square up, my natural tendency is for my elbow to flare out. If I have a off-center grip or a crooked grip, my elbow is going to flare out. So you can see there, the elbow was an effect, and I went below the elbow to the shoulders to show you one possibility of a cause that could be the elbow flaring out. And then I went above the elbow to the grip to show you another possible cause that is causing our elbow to have that effect of flaring out on our shot. So it's not always what you see go wrong that is the problem. It's something related to it that's going to force it to go out of position. All right. So let's go ahead and I'm going to take down my share screen here so I can look at the Q&As and everything else. Let's go ahead and there we go. Let's go ahead and jump into some of these questions. I've got 2 in the Q&A right now. So Mike Little. Mike, would you mind if I brought you on here? I'm going to see if this works. I'm going to click allow to talk, and then Mike, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Matt.
You may hear me because I don't know if the phone works with these.
I'm on now, Matt, if you can hear me.
Mike, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Fine. Can you hear me?
I took him off mute, so
I'm trying to get
to not be able to join in. So I'll give him a call and maybe give you guys some gold nuggets from me and Mike's conversation. Next webinar, next Sunday. Like I said, the email for that registration will go. You guys can hear him. I can't hear him. Let me figure out what's going on here. Let me do this. Hold on a second, guys. Let me, I know why. Give me a second here, Mike. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Hey, Matt, how you doing?
Oh, I can hear.
Okay, we're good. We can talk now. Yeah, I really wasn't trying to take the mic here. I was just kind of sent you kind of a personal email, we could talk privately, but since it's opened up, I'll just share this little bit, and maybe we can talk later if you have time.
Okay.
But, as with you, I've been around basketball a long time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the books that aligns perfectly with what you went through, and I think it's tremendous what you just shared from the standpoint of what goes on in the mind and the level of frustration within the player.
Yes.
When we put so much interference into that, it really restricts the effectiveness, the efficiency of that person's shot, and obviously impacts their emotional and psychological advantage into the game. So there's a book called You Already Know How to Be Great by Alan Fine. And in that book, there is some tremendous insight for coaches. I wrote an article just recently called Foul Line Focus, and I used an illustration from a girls team that went through all the way to the state finals this year, but obviously that was canceled out. But I referenced there are 3 games leading up to it, and I watched players that as I said, from the 8th grade up, that in this anxiety of the game and everything else, players that normally in those situations would hit a percentage of shots at a fairly attractive percentage seem to really freeze up. And these are good players, good kids. In fact, one of the better players airballed it. And I understand, as everybody's on this phone call, that the intensity of the game and everything else, that plays a part in what the emotions and everything else. But as I looked at Alan Fine's book and assessed that to business and also to the coaching world, he talks about the players' faith, belief in their ability to learn and adapt, their passion and commitment, and their intention and concentration. And so I don't expect to make this sale on the call, and I'm not trying to make the sale. I'm just saying that if we as coaches can reduce the interference that goes on within the head of the player, we're going to be highly more effective in advancing their skill sets. I think inadvertently, as I look back on my career coaching and even in business over the years, I did create a lot of interference with the intent of doing good. What you just shared in that first half hour or so was all about really being very efficient in coaching the player from a mental, psychological standpoint, and to free that player up to execute well. And I just think it lies.
I think it even goes beyond that, because a lot of times we as coaches can tell players to do something that isn't comfortable to them. And I think that player needs to be given the leniency to turn around and tell us, Coach, I don't like this. This does not feel good. And so the thing you have to communicate with the player is they need to know the difference between uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Unfamiliar is it feels weird, but it doesn't really affect the shot. It doesn't really hurt them. It doesn't, you know what I mean? They'll say this feels weird, but they're like, hey, I'm going to keep doing this. You know what I mean? Because, and I think it's important for them to get that down, and you have to communicate as a coach, like, I'm going to give you this technique that I want you to do. And you have to understand as a player that you've been shooting your way for however many years you've been playing. And that when I give you this technique, it's going to take you probably 10, 20, 30 shots to start to get comfortable with or familiar. I broke my own law there. It's going to take you 10, 20, 30 shots to start to get familiar with this movement, because your brain has to build this pathway to send the signal clearly to your body of the action it's supposed to execute. And so having that communication point between the player and the coach, where the player isn't afraid to turn around and tell a coach, this hurts, I don't like this. It's disrupting my shot. It's disrupting my movement. It's really bad. A player needs the freedom to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm going to quickly bow out, but let me just share something real quick,
Sure.
and then I'll get off the line here. Alan Fine writes this. He says, most internal noise comes from fear. Not only fear of physical harm, but more commonly fear of being judged, making a fool of oneself, being rejected, or failing. This internal noise produces interference, which negatively impacts performance and results. When there's lack of clarity, confusion, and lack of systematic approach, a person is not going to perform to their capabilities. He shares that the coach needs to be a reducer of interference.
Yes.
And work on a player's faith, believe in themselves, their passion, and their focus.
Yeah.
I wrote quickly that the girls focused, if the girls would have focused on what they could control, going back to this team, I think the results would have been much better. Had they focused on just two things, and it could be different. The routines can be better. Breathing, taking 2 deep breaths with slow exhaling. But it's been proven to relax the body and mind. And number 2, execute your foul routine. Mine was 2 dribbles, a line, up and in. By being focused on what you can control, you minimize the external and internal noise and improve performance. He writes, the big issue to outstanding performance is to eliminate the interference that is getting in the way of experimenting with and using the knowledge the player already has. So I hope that makes some sense. I hope it contributes to what you're doing. But hopefully,
I think that what you just said, I think could be related to the cause and effect as well.
Absolutely.
Where you're not limiting a player to a certain realm of actions. You just give them something to add to what they're already doing.
Yep.
Instead of something that you want to restrict them from doing the things that they're already doing. I think that's a pretty relative point there, to tie these two things together, where you're not simplifying action, you're simplifying information.
You and I have not talked in years.
I know.
So I just want to say this. I want to say this to the audience. What's being shared today, from my perspective, is a tremendous multiplier of what Matt has shared here. Tremendous multiplier in our ability to be effective in our coaches to help players become better shooters.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Appreciate it. Let me get him back to attendee. There we go. And I'll address the next one here. Okay. Andrew asks, I'm a streak shooter, and I often shoot better, even when training with my dad, after I've taken hundreds of shots. I can be 0 for 6 and then make 3 threes in 2 minutes. It is very frustrating, but I can't always get a ton of shots up before a game. I just want to point out here, there are coaches out there, and I don't want to demonize these coaches for doing this, but there are coaches out there who they focus too much on the mental aspect of the game before a game. And some of the most successful coaches that I've been around, again, this kind of relates to our restricting and adding to, is that they won't let a player go shoot around before a game because they think it's going to exhaust the player or fatigue the player and wear them out. And when you're talking about, Andrew, I don't know how old you are, but when you're talking about an athlete or a player getting worn out just from shooting, that's probably one of the biggest lines of crap I've heard. Especially players at a young age, players who are college and below. I mean, you guys see it when you watch the NBA. You start to see these 35 to 40-year-olds. That's when you start to get fatigue. I mean, you got these guys that are elite athletes out there. But, as you get older, that's when you start to see the real effects of fatigue, because our body starts to get less and less efficient at supplying our energy reserves, okay, so to speak. So from a trainer standpoint, my background is in kinesiology and exercise physiology, and we talked about age groups in exercise science, and how the younger age groups up until like the mid-20s, like they don't need a lot of recovery time. They don't need a lot of of energy conservation, so to speak. I'll say this: as long as a player is eating healthy and getting the rest they need at night, getting their 8 hours of sleep or whatever is recommended, they're going to be very good at replenishing their energy. So from a standpoint of you saying, I can't get out and shoot a bunch of shots before I do this, I would ask you, Andrew, like, how often are you practicing, and are you thinking when you shoot? You say you're taking hundreds of shots. I can be 0 for 6 and then make 3 threes in 2 minutes. Are you thinking when you shoot, or are you just shooting and then thinking before and after? One of the things that I think is important for a shooter to understand is when I, as a coach, say, I want you to focus on this thing, you're focused on it until you start the process of shooting, until you start your shot. And then you don't turn your brain back on and focus on, okay, what just happened, until after you've released the ball and everything's gone, and then you just get your eyes up and look for feedback. So it is true that most players, especially elite shooters, they don't think when they shoot. They don't have these. They'll think of a phrase right before they shoot, or they'll think of a how do I want to put it? They'll think of maybe something that's going to help them stay focused in their training. So they'll say a word or a phrase right before they shoot to get them, dialed in, and then after they shoot, they usually verbally out loud say something that lets them know whether they completed and executed what they were focused on before. So verbally calling out what went on, and I think it's important, get feedback and try to figure out, Andrew, what exactly is going on here. What's the difference? And it may be good for you to break out a cell phone or a camera of some sort and record yourself when you're missing, and then record yourself when you're making, and figure out what the difference between these are. Are you typically, when you think about things when you're shooting, you slow down. Your body goes through more slower movements. And so I don't want a player thinking when they shoot. I want them thinking just before they shoot or just after they shoot. That way the movement of the shot doesn't slow down. Okay, it slows down because their brain is trying to think about something and send a message to their body to do something specific. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to slow down the action of shooting just because we're thinking about something. Okay. Let me go over here just to finish up Andrew's answer. William wrote, as a parent, I noticed that this son is not mentally strong. I grew up loving the game and always trying to be a student of the game too. I think he likes the game a lot, but when he shoots around, he is out working on his weakness. When we teenagers playing guys 5 to 10 years older than us, but my son will be a senior in high school next year and plays at the level of his defender, and I'm not playing at the level we know he is capable. Okay, that could be, William, that could be an anxiety issue. There are things that the technique just can't fix. And some players develop anxiety issues. There's even guys in the NBA with this kind of stuff. Kevin Love has anxiety issues. He has mental issues that he's getting help for. And I'm not sure how populated these people are or how abundant these people are around your area. But something you can do is maybe search for a local sports psychologist. It doesn't have to be like a regular psychiatrist or psychologist. There are people out there that we call sports psychologists that are trained in specifically talking with athletes to help them learn how to have better mental focus, who are trained. And this is something that I don't have much background in. I didn't really, I was exercise science. I was sports science. I was not sports psychology. I was not the psychological side of things. I do dabble in philosophy, but philosophy and psychology are kind of different things here. So I've heard of people that have gone and had a couple sessions with a sports psychologist who have really turned around their mental state and allowed them to kind of just be relaxed and be free in their play. So, William, that may be something that that you can look into. There are sports psychologists out there. I'm just not sure what the distribution of them is, and where I'm sure if you go to a city, there's probably at least one or two in a big city. From a rural setting, probably not going to see a whole lot of sports psychologists out in rural settings, just because there's not a market for them there. They're going to make more of their money in a city setting where they can, be able to address the most amount of people possible. So I'm in Ohio, so I live about an hour and a half from Columbus, and I know for a fact that I think there are at least 2 sports psychologists in the city of Columbus, and they may not be easy to find. You may have to do some real deep Google searches, and maybe contact your local university and ask them if they could set you up with anyone on those lines. But William, it sounds like that might be something that you could look into to maybe get them help, especially because they're going into their senior year. But back to Andrew, I think it's good if you film your shot and look at the difference in your shot between when you're missing and when you're making. I'll do a little self-promotional thing here. Our new online network that I just launched in March, that you saw information for on the slideshow there. It's proshotsystem.mn.co. It is a membership site, so it is a paid site. But I'm doing all kinds of things like the talk I had with you guys today. I have all kinds of information like that in there that I'm adding content almost daily for. And we also go through all the different techniques. I'm launching new techniques in that, and that's going to be just a huge instructional site. And we're going to eventually have monthly workouts, maybe even multiple monthly workouts, depending on how quick we get out of quarantine and get back to things, because the summer is usually this is my full-time job. I'm a shooting coach full-time. I've been a shooting coach full-time since 2010. And so, if I can't go out and do camps this summer, I'm going to be hurting. So I'm hoping to grow this online community and have it as a way that I can get out there and get in better touch with people and even train them online. They have access to me where they can message me anytime. And so that's kind of my little 3-minute spiel on that is you're going to find a lot more information like this in that network. But definitely, Andrew, film yourself, look for differences between the two, and then try to find any way you can to get up as many shots as possible before your games and see if that helps. And then make sure you're not thinking while you shoot, because that can really slow you down and cause a lot of problems in a shooter. So Larry asks, can you give an example of the difference between using the action approach versus the information approach? So yeah, I'll even give a pro shot specific example, and that is when we look at the sway, okay, are we coaching a player to understand and perform the sway in as simple an action as possible? Okay, so for instance, are you teaching them to come forward with their feet? And this kind of runs along cause and effect too. Are you teaching them to just land forward with their feet and just addressing the feet? Because that's addressing an action from an effect standpoint, okay? And when I say addressing an action from an effect standpoint, the sway is what you see the player do with their feet, okay? But the sway is not in the feet, okay? The feet are an effect, okay? The shoulders are the cause, all right? So I got to figure out a way to teach this player to sway simply by giving them one simple bit of instruction, and that is I communicate the information by saying, a simple phrase like, For instance, one that I think we worked on when I was out there this past fall, Larry, was shoulder to chin. So giving them a simple point of instruction just like that, where you say shoulder to chin, and you don't say anything else. You don't limit them by anything else. Okay. So in other words, don't go, I want you to go forward with your feet and shoulder to chin, and giving them all this specific, limiting things and then telling them, no, don't do that. Just adding to it. I hope that kind of makes sense. Is we don't want to limit the action that our player is doing. We want to limit the information that we're communicating with our player to do that action. So let me give an example of this NBA shooting coach who limits the action. He goes against what we teach and says, no, I don't want you to turn, because that gets you out of alignment. You need to be able to face the basket and have everything in your shot go forward or up, or forward and up. What he doesn't understand is that the human body is much, much more complex and complicated in its motions than that. Okay? When you look at every other sport that involves an object being propelled by an athlete towards a target, you see what we call rotation. Okay? And specifically, rotation of the shoulders and hips. And that's something that gives a player better power, but indirectly, it also gives that player better accuracy, because from a shooter standpoint, I'm shooting with the right side of my body as a right-handed shooter. Well, if I start here, the right side of my body is on the side. I want to shoot at a basket that's in front of me. So I'm going to shoot and bring that side of my body forward and around so that it's toward the basket, so that it's lined up with the basket. So looking at this from different perspectives, and I know I related it kind of there with cause and effect, and with don't simplify the action, simplify the instruction. And you could say, I know somebody's going to come out with an argumentative point. I like to look at things from different perspectives here. So I know somebody's probably going to come out with this argumentative point, like, well, you just addressed the action when you said go shoulder to chin. Okay, but did I limit their action by saying shoulder to chin? No. Most players shoot and they just shoot like that. Okay, that is a limited action. What I'm doing is giving them instruction on how to complete a technique, okay, that adds to that action. So it's more action for them to come shoulder to chin. It's more movement, okay? It's more complex movement. But I simplified the information by just telling them, make sure you finish with your shoulder in front of your chin. That's simplifying the information. And by simplifying the information, their action actually increases, not only in the amount of movement they have, but it moves them up the line of efficiency, because the sway is a very foundational part of our forest system. And so when we talk about art is going beyond the forest. I'm adding all kinds of things to the forest to show you that the forest that we've taught is just the foundational stuff. That's just the basics. That's just the fundamentals. There's much more to this than just the forest. So that's just kind of the difference between when we teach the forest, we're just talking about the basic foundational stuff. When we teach art, we're talking about an entire array of techniques. You know, in forest, we've only got about 6 or 7 techniques. But in art, we've got 8 techniques that are involved in accuracy, 9 techniques that are involved in range, and 13 techniques that are involved in transitions. That's far more than just 6 or 7 techniques that are in forest. So it kind of helps. Art is just more extensive. It kind of helps the players kind of bring everything together. And it's adding things to the shot by simplifying information, not by simplifying actions. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I just give them a simple phrase of instruction or something along the lines that might add to their motion, but it's a simple, easily understandable way for a player to get better. Okay. So Wayne says, difference in teaching shooting to females versus males. That's a great question. So let me just say this. From a general overview standpoint, I do not want my males shooting differently from my females, and I do not want my females shooting differently from my males. Everything that we teach is from a shooting perspective that covers both genders. Okay. So what I will say is, because of the difference in not really body structure, but the way things work in males and females, the only difference that I have in teaching females versus males is that males typically have more tension and more stiffness in their lower back and hamstrings. And this is because a lot of males focus on what I call the beach body workout, where you're working out your upper body and getting more mass on your shoulders and your chest and your arms and your upper back. And so you're gaining weight and gaining mass on the upper part of your body. And as we know, the difference between males and females, one of the differences anyway, is that the male hips are narrower than the female hips. So males are not made to carry all that extra upper body weight. Females have wider hip bases, therefore they can carry more upper body weight. Okay, and that's for childbirth and all that kind of stuff. So what do we have to focus on? Well, the males have their stiffness in their lower back and in their hamstrings. That doesn't really affect their shot a whole lot. In certain ways, when we talk about the physiology of how the legs work, it can actually help them by getting more force into their hamstrings and their glutes, and allowing them to get a better elevation and a better sway on their shot by extending one side of their body that's forward. Okay, so the thing that you do differently with males and females is you spend more time on the things that females need more. In other words, females have their stiffness and their tension in their shoulders. Males have theirs in their hamstrings and lower back. Having tension and stiffness in your hamstrings and lower back doesn't affect your shot a whole lot. Having tension in your shoulders and neck, like females do, affects your shot a lot. So we have to spend more time on techniques that involve the shoulders, like the turn, the offhand, the sway, the dip, because all four of those are foundational motions that directly involve some kind of movement of the shoulders. And if the females are stiff in their shoulders, they're going to be reluctant to have fluidity in doing those types of techniques. So what we do is we work with them a little extra time and be a little extra specific and a little extra, I guess you would say, lenient in coaching the females, because they need more of a focus on that shoulder area, because that's where their stiffness and tension is. We need to address those problem areas in the females more than we need to address them in males, because most males just do them naturally. Okay, females do not. Another difference in teaching shooting to fit males and females are going to do exactly what you tell them to do. That means sometimes it's important to be very general. Sometimes it's important to be very specific, because if you are too specific on teaching a certain technique to a female, it's going to become rigid. It's going to become slower than it needs to be. And that's where they're getting too much information that they can't simply comprehend it and understand it and incorporate it into their shot. Okay. So again, it's simplifying the information, making it as easy to understand as possible, so that their body isn't restricted in its movement, and teaching a female to be freer with their movement and not stiffen up just teaching them that freer movement can lead to better shooting. Okay, so I hope Wayne that answers your question. Let's go. I see there's people over here in the chat that are commenting some things, so let's just make sure. Devin asked, do you have an opinion on the use of shooting machines, gun, Dr. Dish, to improve versus a live rebounder? Yes, absolutely. Those are really helpful tools to your shooting. And actually, that is going to be one of the things that we cover in one of our later webinars, because talking about tools versus gimmicks is one of our things that is a mistake that some shooters make, is that sometimes they focus on using a gimmick instead of going to a tool that will actually help them. And we'll discuss the difference between tools and gimmicks, and what the characteristics of those tools are that make them tools, and why a gimmick is a gimmick. So that's something we'll talk about later. But yeah, I've guns, Dr. Dishes. There's one out of Iowa. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a good one too. Those are great machines to help players get up a ton of shots, especially once they get comfortable and they're trying to get more and more comfortable and consistent with a certain technique that they just learned or just incorporated in their shot. It's important that they just go get shots up, and get more and more comfortable and more consistent at using that technique naturally in their shot. Okay. William said, we went to Jeff Nelson, 76ers shooting coach, and he hated the sway that my son was doing. I will say this, on a standpoint from the way I think the best way to teach the sway is very similar, but not. It's real. Let me switch that. The sway is very related to the turn, in that it happens in the shoulders. Okay, so I would ask, is your son swaying by kicking his feet out in front of him? Is your son swaying by jumping forward? Those are two things that we don't want to do. When we sway, we don't want to kick the feet. Okay, we don't want to jump forward. Those are two misconceptions that people have had in our shooting techniques. We are not teaching players to jump forward. We are not teaching players to kick their feet out. We're teaching them to jump up and land forward. And there's a specific way to do that when you're using the body in a certain way. It's in the shoulders. And when I say get the shoulder to chin, that's the simplest way I can teach the sway, because it gets everything out in front here. And when I extend my shoulder out in front of me like that, I have a force above my center of gravity that's going towards the basket. So the only way that my body balances itself is with that effect of the sway, with the feet landing forward, depending on, sometimes it's 3 to 4 inches, sometimes it's a foot, depending on how far away from the basket they are shooting. So I will tell you this, there are a lot of NBA shooting coaches that do not agree with what we teach, and it is because they don't understand how players' physiology and anatomy work. They don't understand the philosophy behind it. They don't understand the science and the physics behind it. They don't understand a lot of it. And what I usually go to is, what's their education in? And, I had a discussion with a certain NBA trainer, and he is one of the most renowned NBA trainers out there. I won't use his name, but he's one of the most renowned NBA trainers out there. Trains a lot of different NBA players, and he absolutely hates our stuff. He does not like the sway. He does not like the turn. He does not like the rotation. He doesn't like any of it. And I was having a conversation with him, actually more of a debate with him one day on Twitter. And I asked him a simple question. The question I asked him was, what is balance? He didn't answer it. I don't think he could answer it, because his education was in entrepreneurship. He doesn't know how the body works. He doesn't understand physics behind it. He doesn't understand the physiology behind it or the kinesiology behind it. And just because they had a background in that, I had a conversation or a debate the other day on YouTube with this guy that said he had a degree in kinesiology, and that he graduated 30 some years ago with his degree in kinesiology. And he said he used a complete fallacy in his explanation, because I said the index finger is the strongest finger. And he said, and that's why I want to dominate it with the shot. And he said, well, the index finger isn't the strongest finger. The middle finger is the strongest finger. And I said, are you speaking of eccentric contractions, or are you speaking of concentric contractions? Because if you're speaking of concentric contractions, a concentric contraction is taking the fingers and curling them like this. An eccentric contraction is just the fingers stiffening and being long like this. Okay? This is called static. This is called dynamic. All right? And he suggested, he's like, well, I can bring and meet up with you an ergometer, which is an instrument that measures contractile force. And he says, I can meet up with you. We can take an ergometer and we can measure the strength of each finger and see which finger is the strongest. And I said, then I know you really don't know your kinesiology, because you're talking about concentric actions, because that's how an ergometer measures. It measures the flexing concentric action of a player's finger. And I said, I don't shoot like this. I shoot like this. My fingers stay straight. They're eccentrically involved in shooting a basketball. And so I pointed out the fallacy in his argument, but he couldn't get it. He couldn't understand that was the flaw in his argument. And so you have to look at not just the specific physics behind it, but how these techniques are being used. For the sake of your son, I would ask Jeff, like, why do you not want him to sway? And I could literally destroy his reasoning on why he doesn't want him to sway. And I guarantee you, it's probably because he wants to simplify the action and not simplify the information. Okay, so I hope that helps, William. Let me move on here. Andrew said, thank you, Matt. I made honorable mention All-State. Congratulations. At a small school in Texas, pretty good basketball state. I actually, when I was a JUCO coach, I recruited a lot out of Houston this season, but I left a lot of points on the table. I will check out the member site. Okay, and I made the member site cheap. It's less than $10 a month and less than $100 a year if you pay annually. You save 17%, and it's $9.99 or $99.99 a year, or $9.99 a month. If you guys want to check that out, that's probably going to be my means of income until whenever these school districts open up and let me back into the gym. So hope that helps, Andrew. Just I would again advise filming your shot, seeing what the difference is between the makes and the misses, and seeing if you can identify anything between those. And I do shooting critiques. So, if you need to contact me by email, or if you join the network, the learning network, you can actually send me film, and I'll send you a bill for very little, because I don't charge my network members as much for critiques, and we'll look at it and see what's going on that we can fix. Okay. Mike talked about the IC3 rebounder. It's kind of a more of a home version and a cheaper version of the gun. Doesn't have a mechanical thing that kicks the ball back to you, but it's a big rebounding net that when the ball goes to the hoop, it hits this little feeder that kind of makes the ball roll back to you or bounce back to you, so you don't have to take off chasing it everywhere unless you miss the net completely. So there is that. Looks like all of the answers that I needed to get across. If anybody else had anything, I don't see any hands raised. I don't see any more comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A. I'll give you guys about 30 seconds here. If you have one last question, feel free to shoot it to me. And then make sure you pay attention for the registration email again tomorrow morning. I believe it goes out at 10 a.m. Eastern time for the next chat that we have. We'll have it next Sunday at the same time, and we'll talk about two more things. So today was all about simplifying the information and not simplifying the action of the shot, and looking at cause versus effect. And I'll give you a good illustration for cause versus effect. Sometimes at my clinics and camps, I walk in and I talk to the kids about cause and effect, and I go, what can we see more clearly? Can we see cause more clearly, or can we see effect more clearly? And one of the ways that I communicate this is, it's been raining most of the day here. So if I walk outside and I see the rain, is the rain a cause or is the rain an effect? And I explain to them the rain is an effect. It is an effect of evaporation. So evaporation is the cause. We can't see evaporation. Might be able to if it's a hazy day. You can see it. That haze is typically evaporation or moisture in the air. Okay, but it's not as clear as the effect, which is the actual rain itself. You can feel that rain. You can see that rain visually with the naked eye. You can't always see evaporation with the naked eye. So typically when we look at players shoot and we see something going wrong, err more on the side of that's an effect and not a cause, because it's much easier to see the cause than it is to see the effect. Another example is the sway. It's easy for us to see the feet of the player landing forward because that is the effect of the sway. The cause of the sway is in the shoulder positioning, and the shoulder positioning is what causes that feet coming forward of the shooter. So that's just a way to look at it. Thank you guys. I don't see any more questions or anything in here. Thank you guys for attending. Email will go out tomorrow morning, my time, for anyone who wants to register for the next one. And I hope I'll see you all back here next Sunday. All right. Thanks a lot and stay safe.